Well, the worst Supreme Court justices were not appointed by the worst president. Donald Trump's 3 Supreme Court justices have not yet proven themselves to be worse or more ethically challenged than the 2 who are now in an intense competition for the title of worst Supreme Court justice, Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. They were each appointed 15 years apart by presidents from Connecticut who wanted you to believe they were from Texas. The Bushes were born in Connecticut, where the family had deep roots. The father of the first President Bush was Prescott Bush, a Republican senator from Connecticut. The Bush family preferred to go to college close to home, and so father and son presidents both went to Yale. They were what was then called country club Republicans, which simply meant they hated paying taxes. The first President Bush was a supporter of Planned Parenthood before he was selected to be Ronald Reagan's running mate in 1980, whereupon he had to suddenly pretend that he was opposed to any and all abortions. By the time George W. Bush was running for president, country club Republicans had been banished from the party and replaced by born-again Christians, which George W. Bush claimed to be. 1988 was one of those years when presidential campaign polls could not have been more wrong, giving Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis a 17-point lead in the summer over Vice President George H.W. Bush. We are suffering with the reign of Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court because George H.W. Bush won the presidential election in 1988, served only 1 term, and left only 1 legacy: Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas, who has clearly become the most publicly corrupt Supreme Court justice in history, taking massive amounts of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, to buy a motorhome, for example. Clarence Thomas has not paid income taxes on that money that has been handed to him by a billionaire who doesn't want Clarence Thomas to have to live on his salary as a Supreme Court justice and his wife's substantial income. Clarence Thomas may be a tax criminal. We don't know yet because he refuses to answer questions about the tax treatment of all the money that has been handed directly to him. But personal financial corruption, as egregious as it is, does not leave the mark on history that corruption of judicial scholarship leaves on the Supreme Court and the country and the lives of everyone living under laws written, some would say invented, by the Supreme Court. Which brings us to Samuel Alito, who is the product of a presidential election that was decided by the Republican majority on the Supreme Court. In the year 2000, when the Supreme Court decided to stop counting votes in Florida, their decision, they knew, gave the election to the Republican candidate George W. Bush over Vice President Al Gore. George W. Bush was the first candidate in history who did not get the most votes, but won the presidency. Al Gore got more votes than the person who won the Electoral College, or should I say, in this instance, was awarded the Electoral College by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision. That was the first time in my life that I heard people who had spent their lives respecting the Supreme Court suddenly saying that the Supreme Court had become just another partisan institution. Many people, me included, tried to think of it as a single decision that was a close call, that looked partisan, but might not be. Time would tell if the Supreme Court had become another arm of Republican governance. Now, 24 years later, it's worse than anyone thought in 2000, after the Bush v. Gore decision. Samuel Alito was the first and only Supreme Court heckler during a State of the Union address. Samuel Alito disgraced himself and the Supreme Court when he decided he had something to say during the State of the Union by the first black president of the United States.
Last week, the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests. including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections.
There was Alito saying not true when President Obama was criticizing the court's disastrous decision on campaign finance. Samuel Alito was listening to a president who went to a better law school than he did and was a better law student. President Obama was the president of the Harvard Law Review when he was in law school. Was it a coincidence that the president was black? Would Alito have pulled his punk stunt against a white Democratic president? He hasn't done it again with Joe Biden, but then Samuel Alito hasn't shown up for a single State of the Union address since that time in 2010 when he decided to talk back to the President of the United States, when he decided to be the first and only Supreme Court justice to ever do that. The year before Samuel Alito did that, Republican House member Joe Wilson was the first heckler of a president in an address to a joint session of Congress. It was Congressman Wilson who famously yelled, "You lie," at President Obama. Congressman Wilson's voters in South Carolina, no doubt, loved that. And now heckling the president is something that Marjorie Taylor Greene and her friends think they're good at during State of the Union addresses. So think about that. First, a vile clown congressman yells, "You lie," to President Obama. And then the next year, a Supreme Court justice says, "Not true," to President Obama during his State of the Union address. And now Republicans heckle the president during the State of the Union address, a dozen at a time. Samuel Alito is one of them. If he were a member of the House now, he'd be in the back benches with Marjorie Taylor Greene yelling at the president. He has given an explanation for why he was flying the American flag upside down that is obviously a lie. No sane person could believe it unless it is to be taken as an insanity defense by Justice Alito. When the New York Times reported that the Alito home had the American flag flying upside down after the January 6th attack on the Capitol, which happened right across the street from the Supreme Court, Justice Alito told this lie as his official explanation. "I had no involvement whatsoever in flying the flag. It was briefly placed by Mrs. Alito in response to a neighbor's use of objectionable and personally insulting language on yard signs." Justice Alito did not have the decency to come up with a story that had minimal logic in it. Like his Supreme Court opinions, Alito did not care how preposterous that defense was. So a Supreme Court justice wants you to believe that his wife saw something in a neighbor's yard that made her run out to the flagpole, pull down the American flag, turn it upside down, and run the American flag back up the flagpole upside down as some kind of nonverbal insult payback to her neighbor. I refuse to believe that about Mrs. Alito, and I refuse to believe a Supreme Court justice's attempt to blame this on his wife. 2 full days have passed now since the second flag was found at the second Alito home, the Summer home in New Jersey. The second flag was one that was carried by the attackers of the Capitol on January 6th, just like the upside-down American flag was. This one is called an Appeal to Heaven flag. Justice Alito has not recused himself from 2 cases currently pending before the Supreme Court involving the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, including Donald Trump's possible complicity in that attack. He has, of course, an obligation to recuse himself because recusal is based on the appearance of bias, not the actual fact of bias. Appearance is enough. The fact doesn't have to be proved. It can simply be a reasonable suspicion of bias. Justice Alito's silence about the second flag only amplifies the suspicion every day. George W. Bush did this. Voters who didn't want the Supreme Court to take their rights away but decided there was no real difference between Al Gore and George W. Bush did this. Voters who did not show up to vote in 2000 because they didn't think anything was really at stake did this. We are living in the world created by the voters who, through neglect or their own choice, elected George W. Bush, and the voters who, through neglect or their own choice, elected Donald J. Trump. There is only one way for us to stop the control of our lives by the first president and his Supreme Court justices, and the first President Bush and the second President Bush and Donald Trump and their Supreme Court justices, and that is to vote for a president who will not appoint people like Samuel Alito to the Supreme Court. There's only one person now, one person, standing between us and the next Samuel Alito. And that person is Joe Biden. Today, the Supreme Court issued a Samuel Alito decision, not surprisingly, rejecting a challenge to South Carolina's congressional redistricting map, a challenge brought by voters who said it was deliberately designed to reduce black participation and representation in the House of Representatives. Justice Elena Kagan, in her dissent of the Alito opinion, referred to Alito's, quote, upside down application of the law. Justice Alito actually used the phrase upside down twice in her dissenting opinion, an obvious reference to Samuel Alito's upside down American flag and his upside down legal scholarship.